Continuando con el seminario, presentaremos a Tony Butch. Es profesor de liderazgo educativo en Nottingham, con responsabilidades en el Reino Unido y Malasia. Además, es profesor visitante en la Universidad de Johannesburgo, Sudáfrica, vicepresidente y miembro del Consejo de la Sociedad Británica de Liderazgo Educativo, BELMAS, y ha sido editor de la revista internacional Gestión de la Educación, Administración y Liderazgo, EMAL, desde 2002. Su experiencia previa incluye el nombramiento de profesor en las universidades de Lancaster, Reading, Lincoln y Warwick. Fue presentado con el premio al servicio distinguido BELMAS en 2008 y nombrado miembro del Consejo de Administración de la Commonwealth de la Educación y Gestión, SEAM, en el mismo año. Ha sido consultor, examinador externo, invitado orador principal y director de investigación de 21 países. Actualmente sus principales líneas de investigación son liderazgo escolar comparado, desarrollo de habilidades de liderazgo y liderazgo directivo en contextos internacionales.
Hola. Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure for me to be back in Chile and to have the opportunity to talk with you today about induction for principals with a global perspective. So let me begin by just outlining some broad principles, some of which will be very familiar to you. What we know is that leadership is the second most important factor influencing school and student outcomes. The research done in England by Ken Leithwood and his colleagues showed that leadership can affect student outcomes by as much as 27%. That's a huge dimension. And it's greatly to the credit of Chile that this is recognised here, and so much energy and initiative are going into leadership preparation and development here, which I want very much to applaud. I was struck by what Juan Carlos had to say about the low standards in Chile. So you start in a difficult place in terms of bringing about improvement here. And I was also not surprised to hear that the influence here was the international PISA rankings, which are a driver for policy change in almost every country in the world. There is no politician who is proud of having their country near the bottom of an international league table. And so I see everywhere this pressure to perform in that kind of way. We also know that principals impact on student learning in lots of different ways. Directly, if they are also classroom teachers or they work alongside classroom teachers. Indirectly, by setting up processes for improvement. And reciprocally, by working with and alongside teachers and learning from them, as well as helping them individually. The big question which many systems are not addressing, but Chile is, so how do you bring about the leadership behaviours required to have that impact on student outcomes? And so we see that leadership preparation is widely neglected. Of the 200 plus countries affiliated to the United Nations, the great majority do no leadership preparation at all. So any preparation is what I describe later as inadvertent, accidental, rather than planned. And so induction is very much a key stage in this preparation process, as I'll say in a few minutes' time. What many systems, even most systems, think, as long as you're a qualified teacher, and you've got some teaching experience, you are automatically qualified also to be a principal. And those policymakers in those countries misunderstand one fundamental issue. Being a principal is not the same as being a teacher. I assume I surprised nobody in this room by saying that. It's not the same. It's important to have a teaching background because that gives you credibility with classroom practitioners. But it is not the same. If you can get that message out to ministers of education around the world, I'd be very grateful. But I think in Chile you have that message already. So when we talk about induction, what exactly do we mean? It's really quite an important question to ask, isn't it? And in very general terms, I see it as the process by which principals become familiar with the context within which they are leading. I use the word context here quite widely, rather more widely than was used by Jose and Carmen earlier when they were talking about the school context, but I'll come back to that. The context includes also a professional dimension. So principals typically have been educators for quite some time. Maybe 10 years, maybe 15 years, maybe 20 years, as we've heard earlier. But learning the context of leadership is different from learning the context of the classroom. And then there's the school dimension, which we have heard something about, and I'll say more about that later. And then the interpersonal dimensions. What are the expectations of you as a principal now that you've moved into that role? And how do you respond to those expectations? Because as we know from role set theory, that influences the way you behave, others' expectations of you. So we've heard already this morning from several speakers about the relationship between induction and socialization. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But they're very closely connected. But the other issues we picked out in some work I've done with my colleague David Middlewood is achieving competent performance. A simple question to stakeholders would be, would you prefer a competent principal or an incompetent principal? Is a question which has only one answer, I assume. But the question of how you bring about that competent performance is much more valuable than the rest. How do you bring it about? So that's something we've been thinking about. And thirdly, we have heard something about this already this morning, understanding the culture. Culture is a very elusive concept, difficult to identify and even more difficult to change. But it's a key part of that induction process. As I mentioned earlier, you can have a planned induction process, which is much to be preferred, or an inadvertent one, an accidental one, where you stumble along to try to find your way. You won't be surprised to hear that I much prefer a planned approach to one that happens by accident. So I mentioned socialization earlier. We've heard quite a bit about socialization already today, and I think what that's telling us is there's widespread understanding in the research world, here in Chile as well as globally, about the importance of socialization for new principals, and particularly, but not exclusively, for new first-time principals, described earlier as novice principals. There's a process of adaptation that's required when you become a principal for the first time. Metaphorically, you step out of the classroom and into the principal's office. It's different, so you have to adapt. And so I see socialization and the process of identity as being very important here. And I was interested, Juan Carlos, in what you said earlier, a very interesting point about the difficulty, having appointed a principal, of removing them from their schools in order to prepare them. Because it creates a problem for the school they're working in at that time. I understand that argument very well, but what I would say is this. The short-term pain of doing so is greatly outweighed by the long-term gain for that principal, for the school, and for the education system. And I hope the policymakers might reflect on that. And in France, as soon as someone is appointed as a principal, they leave their previous school and begin their induction process. Immediately. In other words, they take the short-term pain to get the long-term gain. And I think that's very interesting. Not many countries do it, though. I think it's an interesting model. So let's think about professional socialization first of all, if we may. Preparing to become a principal for the first time. Preparing for that change of identity. The question I sometimes ask myself in the morning, when cleaning my teeth in front of the mirror, who am I? You ask us, am I the only one? Who asked that question, who am I? But for the first time principal, there will be a day when they answer that question, I'm a principal, whereas previously their answer has been, I'm a teacher. It's quite important, psychologically, among other ways. So there's a professional element, learning the skills, the processes, the knowledge, the behaviours required to be an effective principal. This is no quick fix. If you look at the systems around the world that take this seriously, it takes a long time. So we heard something about Shanghai earlier. Another country which is consistently in the top 3 in the world in the PISA rankings is Singapore. They have a full-time leadership preparation program in the National Institute of Education, which lasts for 9 months. That's what I call taking preparation seriously. And it's no accident they're in the top 3. These things are connected. So I think that's very important. Then there's the personal socialization issue, the identity issue. Becoming familiar with the notion of now I'm a principal, previously I was a teacher. So what does it mean in terms of what I do and how I behave? And that process is itself quite difficult. And then organizational socialization, becoming familiar with the context in which your newly acquired leadership knowledge is going to be enacted. And for most, we've heard it, this is true in Chile as well as in the rest of the world, for most first-time principals, they are practicing their principalship in a school they've never been in before. That's different then from the experience of those who may move up to principalship in their own school. It's the great majority almost everywhere. So there's a huge challenge for them to become familiar with that context. The process is sometimes described as situational analysis. Let's find out what's going on. And that's really very, very important. And so we've heard this morning about contextual knowledge from Juan Carlos. We've heard about contextualization also from Jose, and we've heard about validating Carmen. I think they're all very interesting points. Know your school. And so thinking about socialization overall, then I would say, first of all, know your job, then know your school. And both of those parts are required. And so I see induction, as others have said already, is a very important part of the socialization process. So a little bit about the experience of new principals. I won't take long over this, I guess it's widely known. They're usually appointed from teaching backgrounds, very common. In Israel, just to give you a different example, they're often selected from military leaders. Retired military leaders are given a very short period of training and then put into schools as principals. The great advantage being, I assume, that they will be good on discipline. They won't know anything about education, but they'll be good on discipline. But most countries don't do that. But what we also know from international research, especially that conducted by the OECD, which is very wide-ranging research, most new principals think they are inadequately prepared. Isn't that a really important finding? They're inadequately prepared. That's what they feel. I do think that's very striking. It's interesting what I heard Carmen say earlier. 55% of novice principals say they'd had no preparation. That's very inadequately prepared, then, isn't it? And totally inappropriate. Also heard, I like the Kitavi and Van der Westhuizen quote, the novice principals experience anxiety. Imagine your first day. Some of you can actually remember your first day, never mind just imagine it. Imagine your first day, you walk into your office with no preparation. And you ask yourself the key question, what am I supposed to do now? Shocking, because that happens in so many systems. And in those systems where principals are deployed to schools, as opposed to one where they choose, that can often happen very quickly. I have a student in China studying leadership preparation right now. She's been reading her findings over the weekend. More than half the principals in her sample were moved to their new school from their previous one as first-time principals within 7 days. Not much time to think about the new role in that context. The other very significant finding for me from the OECD work is new principals are rarely competent in pedagogical innovation. It's a bit less surprising that they're not so competent with human and financial resource management. That's not a surprise so much, although it's an important part of preparation, but not competent in pedagogical innovation. What have they been doing before they became principals? They've been teachers. They've been pedagogues. That's been their role. So that's quite scary, and one of the disappointing features of what I've heard so far today from the research presented by Carmen and Jose and from what Juan Carlos had to say, I didn't sense anything like enough emphasis on the instructional leadership role of principals. But a lot about administration. But I tell you something, being a more effective administrator is not going to improve student learning. It is not. And not enough education systems around the world have grasped that fundamental point. The other problem, and Karen's touched on this as well, recruiting good principals and then retaining them. It's difficult. And Karen was so right when she was talking about role models. If, and the research shows this clearly, if you see your principal is first to arrive in the school every morning, last to leave every evening, and responds to work-related emails at home and over the weekend, and then you think, shall I become a principal? Of course they think, what, and be like him or her? Get a life. So that role modelling that Karen was talking about is so vital. And yet so difficult because so much is imposed on principals from all the stakeholders, especially government. And then, when all that's imposed and the principals perhaps inevitably don't succeed, they are punished for it. You look at it that way, how could you sell the job? Not easy to do it. But to add to that, we're going to give you a really difficult job with high stakes accountability, and we're not going to prepare you for it. Wow. Surprising anybody wants to do it when you think of it like that. Okay, the other thing that worries me, and I've heard a little bit about this today as well, is induction which is conceived as an event. Next Monday is your induction day. Right? We heard a little bit about it this morning. The principal going to their new school for the first time with a district administrator. Well, they didn't always have that, did they? Sometimes they only arrived on their own with a district administrator, and a day's induction was done inside the school. Woefully inadequate. So we need to conceive of induction as a process, a longitudinal process, not something that's unconnected. So here's the kind of suggestions there. Succession planning. I know this is something the two centres are thinking about very carefully. So let's begin with, who are the leaders of the future? How do we identify them? How do we encourage and motivate them? Then how do we develop them? If we can only get that right, there'll be a quantum standard improvement in our education system. Yet it's rarely attempted, let alone succeed. Then prepare them. Bring about leadership preparation. And I'm pleased to say that more and more countries around the world, although still a minority, are recognizing the need for leadership preparation. What's much more difficult is to get a sense of what form that leadership preparation should take. That's a different topic for a different day, and I have to respect the limited time that we have. So not enough time for that now. Then what's the recruitment and selection process? What are the criteria by which we recruit them? And then induction. Say something about that in a minute. We've heard a lot today about mentoring. Mentoring is a critical part of this. I would want to encourage Chile to do even more of what it's already doing, which is to think about that mentoring process. We've heard that from every speaker so far today. All the international research on mentoring is positive about its effects, all of it. There are challenges around the matching process, for example, which Karen was talking about earlier. Any two-person relationship, professional or private, may succeed or fail. Am I right? So that matching process is very important, critical really. And that's very, very significant. And then don't stop once they're there. In service, we heard something about in service earlier. That should continue as well. So who does it? I have to do this quite quickly. Who does it? Sometimes it's done by the local administrator. Now, the district administrator here, we've heard something about that today already. Often the principal's superordinate, boss. If, though, that's confined to procedures and reporting processes, it's a very limited value. Here is the manual. Read the manual and follow the procedures. That won't change classroom learning. I was interested in what you said, Juan Carlos, earlier about this is what the system needs. An induction process focused on what the system needs. Now, of course, there must be some of that. I'm dismissing it totally. There must be some of that. But an induction process should be primarily about what the school needs and what the principal himself or herself needs, not what the system needs. Because the system needs will be defined uniformly, the same for everybody. But every school is different. Every principal is different. So let's customize that preparation and induction. Let's not have a one-size-fits-all model. Now, I'm 1.88 meters tall, and I can tell you one size does not fit all. I cannot buy trousers or shirts from the shops, right? Because then they're up here somewhere, right? And as my mother used to say, that doesn't look good. So let's not have a one-size-fits-all. Much better, though, if it's handled by a professional mentor, as we've heard already from the research, very gratifyingly, especially if that person's experienced in service, your point earlier, is that not a former principal, and successful. That's the best model. And of course, you may have multiple providers in practice. The other issue to think about is, do you have a personalised process where the new principal, himself, herself, co-constructs the induction process? So it doesn't have it done to them, but is developed by them. And if that can be done, I think that's going to be very powerful. I'm very conscious it's lunchtime, but I saw some nice snacks when you had coffee, so hopefully you're not too hungry. So how is it provided? All sorts of difficult decisions here for the centres, for government, and for districts. Are you doing it by individual or by groups? If you do personalised provision, it's more effective, but very difficult to organise and expensive. That's why it's easier, it seems, to let's have a cohort and work with a cohort, even though the needs of the people inside the cohort are different. Do you do it in school or off-site, in a university, in a leadership centre? Another key question to ask. And my own personal bugbear is, don't focus it on administration. Focus it on instructional leadership. Focus it on what is going to make a difference to student learning and school improvement, and especially in Chile, where your public sector is beleaguered. That's what really matters. Not being more efficient in getting your forms in on time, so the local administrator can file them. No offence, local administrators, here in the room. but making a difference in classrooms is really important. So don't focus on the procedures, focus on professional learning, and think about process as well as content. Not what to learn, but how can you bring about that improvement. Mentoring is a very good example of a process-led approach. So is coaching, and so are the networks. We heard from networks from a number of people this morning. Professional learning networks are overwhelmingly successful. I did a very big study for the National College for School Leadership about 5 years ago, where I did a meta-analysis of every evaluation that had been done for any English program. Networking came out overwhelmingly as the most desired process for leadership learning. You're learning from people who are like you, with experiences like you, with whom sharing can be truly meaningful. So I strongly encourage that. So is it aimed at system conformity? Or is it aimed at school improvement? I've probably said enough about that already. And we talk a lot about key performance indicators. So are there a series of boxes that we want principals to tick? Or are we serious about growing that person? You're not a perfect principal on day one. How can you be? You're a baby in the job. How do you bring about that personal growth? And how do you challenge and deal with the issues that many people have mentioned already this morning, the relationships with the stakeholders, the parents who can withdraw their children, the teachers whose role is critical to instructional improvement, and all the other people involved in those issues. Oh, I need 3 hands, and I'm failing in that department. Have I gone the wrong way here? I'm definitely going the wrong way here. Okay, let me say something very briefly about examples of induction schemes. I won't spend much time on this because we're short of time. Finland, you probably know, is the only non-Asian country in the top 6 of the World Peace Organization. And it has an interesting 2-year program for new principals. 2-year program, not 1-day program. 2-year program. That's what I call taking induction seriously. Investing in the future of the system. Sweden also has an induction training program which has pedagogical leadership strongly involved in it. And I was with some Scottish colleagues last week. Their system is in the process of changing. They've got a new leadership centre there, which is very interesting. Netherlands is like most of the rest of the world. How do you bring about improvement for principals? Trial and error. You try something, you fail, so you try something different next time. Not a model to advocate. We used to have an early headship provision program in England, but our National College for School Leadership is in decline, and we don't have that anymore. So most countries have unplanned or incidental induction. So just briefly, a model. I mentioned succession planning already. So for example, every educator in Singapore has an annual evaluation, and that plots the next phase in their development. It's highly centralized, and that won't suit everywhere, but it's an interesting model. What I call a chessboard model. Move this piece to this square. I'm not advocating it for here, but it's an interesting model to think about. So talented educators are then identified early and given that leadership preparation. And then match them carefully with schools. Schools are very different. Principals are very different. Don't put a square peg in a round hole. Politicians in England have this idea. If we only move the best principals to the worst schools, everything would be wonderful. And that model has failed. Because the skills and aptitudes required depend on the individual school. It's not a great principal will be a great principal everywhere. And then keep that process, induction process. You begin it as soon as the appointment has been announced, and you carry it right the way through, beyond the point where it's taken. and focusing on teacher and student learning. Key question, how do you make the teachers in your school more effective at their core job in the classroom? Spend time on that, not on more effective administration. Final slide, and then your rumbling tummies can be satisfied. So what do we know? Principal leadership is central to school quality and to student quality and to student life chances. Heard what Karen was saying earlier. Don't forget, we're doing it for the students. Easy to forget that when you're talking about all these other issues. Secondly, leadership preparation, leadership induction, they're usually neglected. Delighted to see it's not being neglected here. What I do see is a process by which you're trying to find the most appropriate ways of doing induction. You've gone beyond the point of whether you need it or not to the next and most difficult stage, so how do we do it? And if you don't do it systematically, the best thing that happens as a result is you delay principals being effective. At worst, you might prevent them being effective altogether. At best, you delay it. So my answer to the point from Juan Carlos earlier is it's better to inconvenience the school when principal is leaving rather than to delay the effectiveness of the principal when they take up their new role. That's the point you may wish to debate with me. The other important point is the isolation. We've heard so much from speakers already today about how lonely the job is. That's a universal finding. Lonely job. Culture shock, I think it was you, Jose, was talking about culture. It's a culture shock. Lots of research on that. You can reduce that by preparing people properly and inducting them properly. The final point really is a moral point. We had Karen talking about moral compass a little earlier. There's a lot of research now, body of research now about moral leadership, ethical leadership, values-based leadership. To place new principles into schools they've never been in before, with a huge burden of responsibilities placed on them by the system, is immoral. Not just totally inappropriate, it's immoral. So I think, as my final point, it's a moral obligation to prepare principals properly, induct them properly, and support